So, colleagues, welcome to this EU Counter Summit in London. The origins of TEAM date back to, I think, 1993 at a Counter Summit held in Edinburgh during an EU summit there. My own organisation, which is Campaign Against Eurofederalism, the Campaign for an Independent Britain, and other organisations set up TEAM at that time in support of the Danish People's Movement, who were fighting the Maastricht Treaty to get something out of it. So that dates back to there, and if you remember, the Maastricht Treaty introduced the basis of the Eurozone, and all sorts of things at the time. That was held in Edinburgh. As then, this Counter Summit has been convened by TEAM to discuss all sorts of aspects of the EU and the implications on the peoples in the member states across the continent of Europe. And I ask you to talk about either the continent of Europe or the European Union. Just saying Europe is not good enough. That was a propaganda victory of the Commission and all the rest of it, long established. So you talk about the continent of Europe or the European Union to make clear what you're talking about. So we're going to have all sorts of views expressed here. It's not to come to a particular conclusion at the end, except we'll have a statement which I hope everybody and all organisations can put their name to, so we can issue it a statement from this meeting today. And I ask you to respect different positions and so on, because there will be different aspects of it. We're addressing different constituencies, especially in Britain. So we've convened this TEAM meeting today to help support the campaign in Britain who are campaigning to leave the EU in the referendum which we're facing, and it's already getting a bit dirty and so on, as people involved know. So we come to the panel. On my left, your right, first of all, is Kelvin Hopkins MP, who's stood against the EU for many years, especially while he's been in the House of Commons. He's one of the few Labour MPs who've stood up each time he can and has worked hard to do that. And Horst Taubert from Germany, who runs a very good website, German Foreign Policy, which analyses what Germany is up to in and beyond the EU. It's a superb website. There's Brian Denny from both my own organisation and from the trade unions against the EU. He will address the question of the so-called social Europe and beyond that. And there's also Dora, who's travelled all the way from Slovenia via Ljubljana and arrived on Thursday, and she'll be addressing the question of the implications of the euro for her country and the refugee crisis which is going on in her country. So I'll introduce Kelvin and I'll open the conference now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Well, I'm delighted to be here amongst friends from different parts of the political spectrum, but all of whom are critical of the EU. And take over, I think, a democratic view of the world rather than a globalising, anti-democratic view, which I think is what the EU is about. I'm glad John mentioned the fact that we talk about the European Union. I've just put down an early day motion in the House of Commons saying we should use the term European Union, because Europe is a wonderful continent. It's not going to go away. It's full of great countries, great peoples, great culture, great history. It's a beautiful place. But that's Europe. The European Union is a political construct that's been imposed upon some of the countries of Europe on very different issues. So let's call it the European Union, because that's what it is. And I keep constantly pulling people up in the House of Commons to make sure they use the term EU and not Europe. Even people who take our side of the argument sometimes mistakenly use the term Europe instead of EU. So I think that's very important for a start. the EU, I think, is fundamentally anti-democratic. It wants to diminish the role of elected governments and increase and get power in a federal state run by essentially a bureaucracy. There will be democratic forms, but they won't have democratic power. And what they're trying to do is resist power from below, from democratic organisations at local level, political parties, governments, and so on. And I think it's absolutely important that people understand that. It's diminishing the role of the nation state. There was a great political constitutionalist in the 19th century in Britain called Walter Bagehot, and he distinguished between two parts of the constitution, the effective part and the decorative part. And we don't want elected governments to become merely decorative. They've got to have genuine power so their peoples can have a genuine choice in how they're governed. And this is not what will happen through the EU. And if some of those countries choose to become more socialist, that's fine. If they choose not to move in a socialist direction, that's their choice as well. But the countries of Europe should be able to choose to govern themselves. And I don't think this will be a bad thing for Europe in total either. We can work together in a cooperative way. We can have bilateral and multilateral agreements between countries and nations. We can still go to each other's countries for our holidays and so on. You know, there is no problem there. And the idea that if we don't have the EU, we will have war, I think is complete, total nonsense. Actually, the tensions that are now arising in the European Union are much more likely to promote aggression between parts of the EU than having democratic countries where they govern themselves and work together for mutual benefit on matters of where they can agree. So I think that's fairly fundamental. I'm a socialist of the left, have always been. My inspirations were when I was a lad, a man called Aneurin Bevan, who set up the National Health Service, the post-war government when I was a very small child, which established a welfare state, took things into public ownership, but essentially managed the economy at national level. And the thing about the post-war arrangements between 1944 and now, when countries managed their own economies, worked better. We had full employment, economic growth, working class living standards rising at a rate never seen before, and we saw in my from between a child and when I was a student, a transformation of our economies, but they were mixed economies. I mean, they were seen to be capitalist, but in fact had a high degree of socialisation, and we even had conservative governments in the 1950s which had accepted the post-war social democratic settlement. They didn't denationalise, they didn't get rid of the welfare states, and they accepted the full employment, free education, free student education indeed, and all of that. It was only when the evil genius Friedrich von Hayek got hold of the political class in Britain and elsewhere, but particularly in Britain, we saw things change, and we saw Margaret Thatcher came into power, and she held his book Road to Serfdom as a kind of Bible. And Friedrich von Hayek, who was totally opposed to post-war social democracy, democratic socialism, he said it was the greatest day of his life when Margaret Thatcher was elected. Now, that's a left view, and you know, I don't trespass on other people's views. I have a slightly different view, but someone who's regarded as of the right, but I think writes very important things, a man called Thierry Baudet, The Significance of Borders, a very, very significant book. And I don't think he's speaking up for democracy, the rule of law, and democratic choice at national level. And the idea of getting rid of borders is, I think, in his view, very dangerous, and I think he's absolutely right. This is not to say we're going to be nationalist or exclude other people in total, but we manage our economies at a national level. We've seen also, of course, my arguments about democracy, one thing, but arguments about economic, what's happened to the economy in Europe, in the European Union. Almost made my mistake there. Across the European Union, we've seen low growth, we've seen mass unemployment, we've seen peoples emigrating in their hundreds of thousands. You know, Ireland is considered to have solved its problem after the crisis, but actually what Ireland did was they saw 300,000 Irish people emigrate to find work. If you multiply that up on a British level, you know, we're 15 times as large as Ireland in population. If 4.5 million people had left Britain to look for work abroad because of the economic crisis, I think there would have been serious political implications in Britain. In Spain and particularly in Greece, you've got 25% unemployment, 50% unemployment amongst young people. You see the economies contracting in Greece, and the only way out of that for Greece's difficulties, and I put this to Greek people of the left, would be to recreate the drachma, devalue, so you can have a break on imports, generate more demand in their own economy, and start to recover. And until countries can actually manage their economies by having, first of all, their own currency, so they can find their appropriate parity for their currency, and secondly, controlling their own interest rates, which goes together with having your own currency, you're not going to see the European Union recovering from the crisis in which it is now. And indeed, I think it's going to get worse, especially if there's another world crisis, which is I think, likely to happen. But I see the European Union as a subset, if you like, of globalisation, of the neoliberal model, and those people who want to take away democratic power, give it to the corporate world, and have complete freedom of movement of capital, and indeed all other forms, measures, parts of production across national boundaries worldwide. And the European Union is doing its best to diminish national governments within the European Union, but it's a subset, as I say, of globalisation. And if you want an evidence of that, I think you've got TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That is being negotiated in secret with the corporate world without democratic involvement. And that is about breaking down democratic control at local levels, even and they'll do it as they always do, with incrementally they'll get worse. But even now, it's likely that if TTIP is implemented, you'll see a situation where big companies can sue governments for loss of future profits if they, for example, chose to renationalise their health service. I would say in Britain, for example, we want to take the bits of the health service that have been privatised, bring them back into a publicly provided public organisation. But if American health corporations lose future profits because of that, they would then be able to sue the British government for the loss of future profits, whatever they might be, and they might be billions. So I think TTIP is a if you like, a conclusive proof that the EU is about globalisation, it's about breaking down democratic government, it's about stopping countries choosing how they govern themselves, and that will be of no benefit to working people. If you go back to, I think you go back a long time. I've been involved in the issue for a long time. I was in my town, I represent Luton North. I'm a Labour MP for Luton North, and 40 years ago I was the chair of the Vote No campaign in the Luton part of the referendum at that time, and I haven't changed my view. But economics is what I did. I worked in the trade union movement, and in 1979, Britain was on the verge of joining what they call the snake, the European monetary system, which was the beginning, if you like. It was the embryo for which became the euro. And I wrote a note to my general secretary of my union saying, this will be disaster, we must oppose this. My general secretary went to the TUC, the headquarters of the British Trade Union Movement, and put that case to the Economic Committee. They went to see Dennis Healey, was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, and we didn't join the EMS. Now, I'm not saying it's down to me, I don't think I'm that powerful, but on the other hand, Dennis Healey clearly agreed with our view that the EMS would be a danger. 10 years on, of course, Britain made the disastrous mistake of joining the ERM, driven by the Euro fanatics again. They wanted to get rid of our currency, and the step towards that would be fixing our, the sterling in relation to other currencies. And I wrote a paper for my union again saying this would be disaster. I predicted the course of what would happen. I said it would eventually collapse under a pile of enormously high interest rates. And it's actually proved. When I said that at the beginning, nobody believed me in the union or across the union movement. When it proved to be exactly right, 2 years later, when we had the collapse of the ERM strategy, the sterling fell out of it, the big devaluation, the economy started to recover. It destroyed, actually, the credibility of the then Conservative government, which led on to the Blair victory in 1997 when I was elected. I got through the net because Blair was a Euro fanatic, but somehow they thought I was, I think, old, and I thought I wouldn't last long. I was in a marginal seat and therefore wouldn't win. Well, now I've got nearly 10,000 majority, and I've had that for a long time. But you know, and I caused a nuisance to the right-wing Euro fanatics ever since. Sorry about the right-wing, but you know, there are Euro fanatics on the left as well, of course. But I've been a nuisance. But I argued this case consistently over a very, very long period, and indeed I think what the reason why Britain didn't join the euro, even despite of Tony Blair's efforts, was because our treasury had been very badly burnt by the ERM experience in 1992, and they didn't want that humiliation again. It's been suggested indeed by Larry Elliott, who writes for the Guardian newspapers, the economics editor. He said if we'd joined the euro at the then parity, by now we would have crashed out. We would have been like Greece, but written 5 times larger. We would have crashed out of the euro by now. We'd have ruined our economy, but we'd have crashed out the euro, and it would probably have brought the whole euro edifice down. The euro, I think, is what I call the dark heart of the EU, because I think fixing currencies, making one single currency with a central bank, one interest rate, I think that is what, if you like, another bit of conclusive proof that the European Union is about destroying democratic government at national level. It's only when we have democratic government at national level, when we can get rid of our governments if we don't like them. If they do things we don't like, we can get rid of them and have another government. And we do it in democratic ways. And that's a way of avoiding all the problems that arise in dictatorships, if you like. Because, you know, you can remove a government, it takes the pressure off. That's how democracy works. And I think we want to save democracy. I think I have to say I'm fairly optimistic we're moving in the right direction. The enthusiasm for staying in the European Union is very, very weak in Britain now, and even those who are campaigning inside the Labour Party for staying in the European Union, I think are not getting much enthusiastic support. And we've stolen a march with our campaign. I'm working with colleagues in other parties in Parliament with the Leave campaign, and I hope very much that we shall win. But I think I'm not alone in thinking the euro is a problem. I spend a lot of my time going to meetings in the European Union in different countries because I'm on the European Scrutiny Committee in the House of Commons. And every 6 months we go and have a pre-presidency meeting with countries that have the presidency. And even in Holland, a couple of years ago, we had lunch with the ambassador. That's what we do with MPs, it's all very nice. There was a senior journalist, like the editor of one of their major newspapers, and he said openly, the euro is doomed, he said. It was a big mistake. And so we were not alone. He was not a person of the left or the right. He was just a journalist who was saying, that's the direction it's going. So I think the European Union is in crisis. And I think for all sorts of other reasons, which others will talk about. I've just seen, this came to through my door this morning, the New Statesman. It's the journal, seems to be of the centre-left, Labourish intellectual journal. The end of Europe, it says, and there's an article suggesting that the European Union is in serious trouble indeed, and is starting to fray at the edges, and it could be moving towards a very different world. I think we've got to argue there is an alternative world. It's a democratic world where countries govern themselves. We work together in true internationalism, where we cooperate with countries on a mutually beneficial basis, but we choose what we negotiate about, what we collaborate on, and we don't have it dictated to us by an essentially undemocratic bureaucracy in governing the countries of the European Union. So I'm optimistic, but we've got to I think to campaign to make sure we win this referendum first. It's not just about Britain, it's about the rest of the European Union, and I think once we've come out, I think other countries will look at their own situations and think about their futures too. So thank you very much indeed.